Welcome to the B'nai B'rith International podcast. I'm your host, CEO Dan Mariaschin. Thank you for spending some time with us today. I'm pleased to have as my guest today Sarah Fainberg, visiting professor of Israeli Affairs at Georgetown University's Center for Jewish Civilization and lecturer at Tel Aviv University's Diplomacy and Security Studies program. Dr. Fainberg is an expert on Russia and on anti-Semitism. She previously served as a research fellow at the Institute for National Security Studies in Tel Aviv. She's also the co-author of Secularism on the Edge, Rethinking Church-State Relations in the United States, France, and Israel. I'll be speaking with Dr. Fainberg today about the state of anti-Semitism in Europe and Russian policy in the Middle East and how COVID-19 may have affected it. Welcome to the program, Sarah.
Thank you. Good morning, Daniel. It's a pleasure to be here.
Before we begin on the issues themselves, you have a very interesting family history. You were born in the Soviet Union. Your father was a dissident. He was imprisoned for a number of years. Family made its way to France. Tell us about that story and how that experience has informed your career and your worldview.
Mm-hmm. In fact, I was born in France, and of a couple of 1968, my dad was imprisoned 5 years in a psychiatric prison in Leningrad and in Moscow because he was one of the 7 demonstrators on the Red Square on August 25th, 1968. You remember at that time, this demonstration was maybe the climax of the dissident movement, and in particular of the struggle to free Czechoslovakia from the sudden invasion by the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact allies. My mom was a young French journalist, activist in France on behalf of dissidents. And I was born out of the interview. When my dad was released, he was first sent to Israel and then to London, and this is the way they met. I was born just 4 years after his release from one of the most horrific, violent, and crushing oppressive environments in the Soviet Union, which were the psychiatric hospitals. These were institutions where perfectly sane people were sent to, not because of their disease, not because of their symptoms, but because of their opinions. And my dad carried out one of the longest hunger strikes in the Soviet Union, 2 months and 2 days. And he was released out of a miracle. One of the psychiatrists in the prison, Kapitan Lev Nikolaevich Petrov, and a major officer of the Ministry of Internal Affairs, the psychiatric prisons were managed by the KGB and the Ministry of Internal Affairs, decided to free my father. And in this small and extremely violent environment, he took the risk to bring to foreign correspondents in Moscow my father's declaration of hunger strike. And the KGB could not understand why in the morning of March 1972, a man by the name of Victor Fainberg was declaring a hunger strike in the solitude of his cell, and that in the same day it was published in Voice of America, in the BBC, everywhere in the world. The memory of this righteous, I call him a righteous among the nation, nobody paid a tribute to his memory. He died before the fall of the Soviet Union, and my father couldn't reveal this story in fear of endangering his life. And in fact, a month ago, I did a lecture before, the coronavirus situation about him. And I was contacted by the mayor of Ra'anana to have one of the streets of Israel named after Capitan Petrov. So this is the story.
Wow. Wow. Now, you could have gone into any other field, but you went into the field that you did, which is Russian studies and strategic studies. So did this story of your father, did this really have that kind of impact on you, that this is what you were going to do, or you decided later on to do this?
You know what, Daniel? You were an activist for the Soviet Jewry movement. And what really formed my worldview as a kid and as a teenager growing up in France was this articulation, marriage between a very, very strong commitment to Israel. The Soviet dissident movement was a movement very, very close to Israel and to the refusnik movement. I will not, it better than I do. And on the other hand, and in a way that is completely, you shouldn't separate, inseparable, the human rights concern. And this is my worldview. I came to Israel and I came to the field of Israel national security study and on, Russia's policy in the Middle East with those two axioms in my mind. First of all, a commitment to a strong, thriving Israel, and a commitment to the same values that were defended by the human rights movement in the Soviet Union, and in which you had an overwhelming overrepresentation of Jews. And I have to admit, Daniel, that since I made Aliyah 8 years ago, I'm still looking for political parties, political figures who will embody this kind of, this union, this ideological union articulation between the two. And in whatever I do in Israel, as a policy advisor, as a researcher, as a lecturer, my horizon is this horizon, which was the ideological horizon of the Soviet dissident movement. I was also greatly shaped in my worldview by my own experience growing as a teenager and as a student in France. I was a student during the Second Intifada. I saw firsthand the sweeping rise of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. I saw the ways in which the liberalism and the liberal parties in France became anti-Semitic movements in their core, in their tropes, in their vocabulary. So this is this mixture of experiences from the Soviet Jewish environment and the French Jewish experience that shaped has informed my work and my desire to contribute to the state of Israel.
Well, let's use what you've just said as a point of departure on the question of anti-Semitism in Europe. France, of course, has been really a focus because of the violent terrorist incidents, many incidents of anti-Semitism. But it's, of course, not just in France. I mean, it is throughout Europe, from the left, from the right, from Islamic extremists. Give us your take on the situation now and what you see going forward.
Look, I just want to address the latest developments, in the past 2 months under the COVID-19 crisis. What I observed from Israel was a toxic mixture between two phenomena. The first phenomenon was the return of the poisoning the wells trope of the Middle Ages. And what I mean, I'm sure you have followed this also, Daniel. You know that the health minister, Agnès Buzyn, is the daughter, of a couple of Holocaust survivors.
The health minister in France.
Yes, she just stepped out as
Right.
a health minister. The director general of the health ministry, Jérôme Salomon, is also the son of Holocaust survivors. The health minister, Agnès Buzyn, was also the daughter-in-law of Simone Veil, of the famous Holocaust survivor that has shaped French and European politics. And as I'm looking at the ways in which she's been treated in the press, I'm not talking about extremist, Islamist, far-right Facebook posts. I'm talking about regular journalists. What I'm seeing, Dan, for the first time is a full normalization, mainstreamization of anti-Semitic tropes. And you know, in the 2000s, anti-Semitism belonged mainly to the far left and to the far right, and to the mixture, to the juncture. You know, we've seen it with Dieudonné and Soral. Now there is a mainstreamization. It is suggested, it is insinuated in the mainstream discourse. Why? Because we're not talking about Israel. We're not talking about the Palestinian issue. We're not talking about issues that are external to France. We're talking about a national health emergency. The second element, I've just mentioned the poisoning the wells trope, is the overrepresentation of Jews in the number of victims of COVID-19. You know that France's Jews represent nearly 0.75% of the entire French Jewish population, and they do represent now more than 5% of the casualties and the deaths of the COVID-19's. You know, it started, you can explain it by various factors. First of all, the overwhelming majority of Jews do live in Paris, and Paris was the epicenter of the epidemic. Also, there was a major wave of contagion during Purim, the Purim holiday, like in New York City. So there was this feeling in France that Jews were the super spreaders at the beginning of the COVID-19 disease throughout France. So you put those two elements together, the establishment that has been long associated with the Jews. You remember when Macron was elected, because he worked for Rothschild, he was perceived as a Jewish, a puppet of the Jewish establishment. And on the other hand, the Jews as super spreaders, it creates a very, very toxic anti-Semitic atmosphere. And again, that doesn't pop up in the margins, but in the mainstream discourse. So you ask me how I see things develop. I think we need to take a long-term historical perspective. When we talk about French Jewry, and I worked on this issue with Professor Yossi Shane, whom you interviewed in this podcast, you see that since the 1950s and 60s, you have a decline of this community. Maybe demographically speaking, it's been bolstered by the immigration of North African Jews, but in terms of its intellectual production, in terms of its ability to renew itself, in terms of its connection to the French Republican dream or the French Republican vision, it is hard to see how French Jewry will be able to sustain itself as a model. And I think the COVID-19 crisis may precipitate its downfall. First, because of the financial crisis, the Jews are going to be economically affected. Second, because of the lack of social and political mobilization capacity. And third, because of this rise of anti-Semitism, not in the margins, as I said, but as a mainstream trope that we're seeing spread in the French media and in the French political discourse. I don't think that French Jews will necessarily do aliyah en masse to Israel. We don't have the right numbers for the Jews. As you know, we don't know how many Jews do leave France for Canada, for example, for Montreal or for other cities. But I do think that we're going to see what the French sociologist Danny Trom coined as France without Jews. La France sans les Juifs. France without Jews. And I think that after the case of Agnès Buzyn, the health minister, being publicly demonized as the main person responsible for the COVID-19 crisis in France, I think it's going to be extremely difficult for politicians of Jewish origins to come back to political life.
So let's move to Russia. Just before we get into some of the strategic issues, let's talk about COVID-19 in Russia. It has hit Russia hard. In the beginning, wasn't clear. Now it's becoming much clearer. Has COVID impacted in any way Russia's foreign policy activity?
First of all, regarding the numbers, Russia now is the third largest country in terms of COVID-19 victims. You have over 470,000 people who contracted the virus, over 6,000 deaths. And of course, those numbers are underestimated because it's Russia and because no country has accurate numbers of the number of victims. Second, it's important to underline the fact that the Russian establishment was badly affected, including the prime minister, the spokesperson of Putin, including the president of the Chechen Republic, Kadyrov, who holds the key of the Caucasus, who is a person very active in Syria. He's been hospitalized, including the chief rabbi of Russia, Ber Lazar, who has just been hospitalized. So we're seeing that Russia has been hurt quantitatively, but also qualitatively in terms of the people being affected. We've seen in terms of its foreign policy that Russia, as other countries, as Iran, as North Korea, as Venezuela, has tried to leverage the crisis to put an end to the American and European economic sanctions. Russia, since the summer of 2014, is obsessed by the lifting of economic sanctions that have hardly hit its economy as a whole. So this is the first move. This move did not succeed. The second move that we've seen is an attempt by Russia to use and leverage this crisis as a way of rapprochement with the Trump administration. There's been a lot of dialogue surrounding two main issues. The first one is the exchange of medical aid and support and collaboration surrounding the COVID-19 crisis. And the second one is surrounding the OPEC crisis, the oil production crisis. You know that the United States, Saudi Arabia, and Russia ended up with a new deal on April the 12th of significantly cutting the oil production of the 23 OPEC countries. For Russia and Saudi Arabia in particular, these cuts are very, very hard, from 11 million barrels a day to 8.5 million barrels a day. For Russia, it's a major, major economic blow. And Russia used this crisis to leverage some kind of rapprochement with the United States, also leveraging the crisis between the United States and China, using this crisis also to foster some kind of rapprochement. The third area of Russian increased involvement was humanitarian aid across Europe. In Italy, in particular, you know that Italy is by far the most pro-Russian European Western country in terms of collaboration at the strategic level, defense-wise, economic-wise. So Russia conducted a humanitarian assistance policy vis-à-vis Italy, vis-à-vis Serbia, also, which is a very important Russian ally in the heart of Europe. So Russia has conducted this humanitarian outreach, of course, to squeeze in some additional political or economic dividends across Europe and the European Union. The last area is the Middle East. We haven't seen a decrease of Russian activity. We have seen a significant increase of Russian activity, in particular, Daniel, in Syria and in Libya. In Syria, Russia, for example, named a new special envoy. As a matter of fact, her ambassador in Baghdad, in Syria, in Damascus, as the new Russian envoy to Syria. You know, up to now, Russia had two envoys in Syria. One of them was the special envoy Lavrentiev, and the second one is the special Russian envoy in the Middle East, Mikhail Bogdanov. So what is the significance of sending a third envoy to Syria? The first significance is balancing between Russia's military involvement and Russia's diplomatic achievements in Syria. We are in a critical stage when Russia needs to convert its military dividends and gains into diplomatic victory. It's not, it's not guaranteed at the moment, especially given the fact that you have other actors that are very active in Syria for the moment, not only Turkey, but also the United Arab Emirates. So Russia has conducted a very intense diplomatic activity in Syria in order to make sure that it will continue to maneuver the political and diplomatic situation in Syria. On the military front, Russia is opening a third base now in the last days in the northeast part of Syria, at the border with the Kurdish region of Iraq, you know, after her air base in Khmimim and her naval base in Tartus. So now Russia is opening a third military base in order to better entrench its military presence. Russia has been extremely active in Libya, supporting the Haftar's regime. Russia has collaborated also with Turkey on the COVID-19 issue. And last but not least, Russia has reactivated its activity on the Palestinian front in the wake of the announced annexation of the Jordan Valley as early as July 1st in Israel. So this is, you could have expected a decrease of activity, and on the other hand, we've seen the opposite of a major increase of activity across the Middle East and North Africa.
Well, there's another player in Syria, and that's Iran. And the cooperation to preserve the regime of Bashar Assad was Russians, the Iranians, and their proxies. What is the state of the relations between Russia and Iran on the future of Syria?
So regarding Russia's position, Russia sees Iran as a very useful ally militarily. You know, if there is a country that paid the price of blood of the Syrian war, this was Iran and the Shiite militias. On the other hand, Russia is not interested to have Syria transformed into a new Hezbollah. Russia is not interested in having Iran having the upper hand in Damascus over the regime of Bashar al-Assad. Russia wants a balanced Syria and a Syria in which it will be able to maintain its economic presence, its diplomatic presence, its military presence. And in order to do so, Russia needs to maintain this fine balance between a military Iranian presence that will continue to ensure the stability of the Assad regime on the front with Syria, with Israel, with Lebanon and Iraq. And on the other hand, it wants to make sure to maintain its domination and its influence on the Syrian army of Bashar al-Assad and on the Syrian regime as a whole. That is why you have observed a kind of schizophrenic policy of Moscow, speaking Farsi with Iran and speaking Hebrew with Tel Aviv or Jerusalem in order to maintain this very fine balance of a useful but contained military Iranian presence on the Syrian front lines.
Let's talk about that. Russian-Israeli relations. Vladimir Putin was in Israel a few months ago. Comment on that.
So Vladimir Putin was in Israel a few months ago to commemorate the anniversary of the Holocaust. It was one of the major events of Holocaust memory in Israel. I have two comments on this. First of all, Russia and Vladimir Putin in particular have a genuine interest today in the preservation of Holocaust memory. And I have to say that from this point of view, whereas Israel is finding itself in a deep crisis with Poland, in a complicated conversation with the Baltic states, in
situation in Ukraine, for example, in Ukraine?
In Ukraine, the situation became different under the presidency of Zelensky and of Poroshenko before. But whereas Israel is finding difficult to speak about the Holocaust with many Eastern European powers, you see in Russia an ally to preserve on the international stage the memory of the Holocaust. Likewise, Russia sees in this dialogue with Israel and in the promotion of Holocaust memory in Israel and via Israel, a way to bolster the legitimacy of its main World War II narrative. You know that the Russian regime today is primarily based on the memory of World War II, not on the memory of the Soviet Union, not on the memory of Stalinism, not on the memory of Tsarist Russia, but on the victorious imagery of World War II. And here Israel acts as a whitener of Russia's ideology. If the state of Israel, a Western democracy, does endorse the Russian narrative, it means that this narrative should be acceptable to the entire world. So you have this kind of exchange or dialogue between the two countries based on that premise. On the one hand, Israel sees a partner in Russia for the preservation of the Holocaust memory worldwide, which now is being eroded in many European capitals. And on the other hand, you see Russia leveraging Israel as a provider of legitimacy to its nationalist, militaristic narrative. I will add to this that the memory issue has been used by both parties as a sideline dialogue to help maintain other extremely sensitive, extremely circumambulated, extremely explosive issues between the two countries in the last years, and especially since Russia entered the Syrian front lines. You know, for the first time, Israeli soldiers at the Kiryat had to deal with Russian soldiers or Russian private military contractors in Syria. It wasn't an easy situation. It was a situation marked by crisis, by ruptures. So the dialogue surrounding the Holocaust was always hampering, softening the Russian-Israeli dialogue in times of crisis. So there was a instrumental dimension to it also in the last years.
Sarah, do you think that you talk about Holocaust and memory, but this large Russian Jewish population in Israel over the years, over 1 million people who came in really a relatively short period of time. I think back to Russia in the Middle East in the 1960s, in Egypt and in Syria. And I think of that era, and now we're in a different era, but the Russians are back. In between, you had this in-migration of so many Russian Jews. Has that had an impact on Putin as a factor of a connection that eases that relationship, as you said, kind of putting aside perhaps some other more explosive issues? But is that also part of the dynamic?
Absolutely. Russian Jews, by the way, most of them do not come from Russia. They come from the Ukraine, Belarus, the Baltic states, you know better than me, Kazakhstan. The Russian ones are a minority, have been leveraged by President Putin within his grand design of reviving Ruski Mir, the Russian world. This is part of his classical diaspora politics that he's been conducting in Ukraine, in Kazakhstan, in the Baltic states, also in Germany and the United States. So yes, Russian Jewry in Israel is part of this grand design, and they are coined as Russians, as part of this Russian world by Putin himself. Second, due to his personal history, Putin has a genuine concern and care for Russian Jewry. You know, you can put a psychologist in the room, you can put a historian in the room, but the fact is that Putin grew up in next to a family of Orthodox Jews in Leningrad. And Putin grew up with major Jewish figures who became companions en armes of Putin himself during his political trajectory. So Putin has a genuine concern for Russian Jews, for their safety and security. And I do remember that during periods of major crisis, such as the 2014 operation in Gaza, you know, Russia wanted to make sure that the Israeli civilian population would be protected out of concern for also this, out of solidarity for those Russian Jews. Now you have a reverse question. What was the impact of those Russian Jews on Israeli politics, on Israel's relations with Russia? You know that part of the Israeli establishment, whether political or security or military, comes from this world, comes from They do speak Russian. They do think in Russian. Israeli soldiers at the Kiryat dialogued in Russian with their Russian counterparts in Damascus or in Khmimim. So there is this kind of affinity. They share a same Weltanschauung, if you would like to use that expression. And I think that really helped in this Russian-Israeli bilateral relations. If you look at the Russian-Israeli relations from a regional perspective, these are very complicated and balancing and explosive relations. If you look at them from a bilateral perspective, cultural perspective, scientific perspective, technological perspective, these are excellent relations. So this is the kind of tango that Russia and Israel are dancing together. And this tango has some kind of Russian Jewish music of this history that helps that dance going on as well in the background.
Sarah, we've got just a little time left, and we didn't really cover Ukraine at any length. But what's your prognosis now for the situation in eastern Ukraine going forward?
So 1 year after Zelensky became the president, we've had very, very little progress on the eastern Ukrainian front. The two major progress were, one, the president managed to revive the Normandy format. The negotiations stopped for 3 years, and he was able to reactivate the negotiations between Russia, Ukraine, France, and Germany. And second, he was able to strike a major prisoners exchange. This being said, now the situation is completely frozen, and we have two new elements in mind, to keep in mind. First of all, this war is extremely costly for Russia, economically speaking. And now that we have the COVID crisis going on, you have some voices in Moscow, in the establishment, that are questioning the raison d'être of Russia's systematic aid, including economic aid to Eastern Ukraine. Second, you have the COVID crisis going on in Eastern Ukraine. You've had people who were affected by the virus. We don't know how many people were affected. The eastern part of Ukraine was completely separated from the western part because of this crisis. So all of these elements tend to point to a direction of complete freeze of the conflict, as we've seen in Georgia and Abkhazia and in other frozen conflicts across the Eurasian space.
Well, Sarah, thank you very much for joining us. I hope you'll come back. We've really just touched the surface on so many of these issues. Thank you to Sarah Fainberg for joining me today, and thank you for tuning in. If you like what you've heard so far, make sure you never miss a show by clicking the subscribe button wherever you get your podcasts. And be sure to visit our website, b'nai b'rith.org, to learn about our work, like us on Facebook, and follow us on Twitter. For my guest, Sarah Fainberg, I'm your host, Dan Mariaschin. We'll talk to you next time on the B'nai B'rith International Podcast.